I'm Mr. Beat. You got a problem with that, huh? Step up if you got a problem with that. Come on, let's go. I'm sorry, I'm just in a bad mood after researching for this video. It's got me all negative, cynical, paranoid. You see, this video is about mistakes. Look, all human beings make mistakes. No one is perfect. This is why everyone should be canceled. Anyway, American presidents are not immune to this. This video is about the greatest mistake of every American president while they were in office. Their worst failure. Their biggest oopsie. You get it. When I say greatest mistake, I mean the one thing they did that hurt the most people. And when I say thing they did that hurt the most people, I say it with my historian hat on, looking at all of American history. So I guess recent presidents have the advantage of all of us not knowing the full extent of damage they truly have done. Okay, let's do this. George Washington. Even my favorite president wasn't perfect. The biggest flaw in his presidency was his failure to use his influence to call for an end to slavery. By the time he was president, he had long privately said that slavery was bad and needed to go away, but his worry of his own financial security prevented him from freeing his own slaves. Imagine if such a unifying figure as Washington went public about him being against slavery and freeing all his slaves while president. The country would have been so much better off in the following decades. John Adams. Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts, 4 of the worst laws in American history. The Naturalization Act made it harder to become a citizen. The Alien Friends Act allowed the president to easily imprison or deport any foreigner who they thought was dangerous. The Alien Enemies Act gave the president even more powers to detain foreigners during a war. And the Sedition Act, which was the worst of them all in my opinion, made it illegal to talk trash or make up fake news about the federal government. I hope you realize the Sedition Act spit all over the First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson. First of all, Jefferson, of course, was even worse than George Washington when it came to slavery. Sure, for most of his life, he called for it to eventually end, and he did sign a law to ban the importation of slaves while president, but he likely fathered multiple enslaved children with one of his young slaves and owned more slaves than any other president in American history, and he didn't free almost all of them. Ugh, Jefferson. But that all aside, I think his biggest mistake while he was president was signing the Embargo Act of 1807. It banned pretty much all trade with Britain and France. Jefferson supported the law in order to avoid war with both countries, but it ended up devastating the American economy. The country lost tens of millions of dollars and tens of thousands of jobs. James Madison. In my video about every president's greatest accomplishment, I said Madison's biggest achievement was holding Britain back during the War of 1812. Ironically, though, I think his biggest mistake was failing to prevent that war from happening in the first place. They called it, quote, Mr. Madison's War, for good reason. After all, he convinced a divided Congress to move forward with declaring war on a much more powerful country that could easily defeat them if it really wanted to. It was reckless, to say the least. James Monroe. Monroe's biggest mistake was signing the Missouri Compromise. I used to be more indifferent about the law, but after learning more about it, I can more confidently now say it was a major cause of the Civil War. The Missouri Compromise admitted Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state to maintain the equal balance of slave states and free states that had already existed. It also prohibited slavery north of a line of latitude west of the southern border of Missouri, despite the fact that Monroe had expressed several times that he wanted slavery eventually abolished. This law, in fact, made the institution more permanent. Sure, it avoided a national crisis, but it only kicked the can down the road. The crisis would only get worse later on, and Monroe could have prevented it. John Quincy Adams. You all know me. I'm still the same old teach. I hate tariffs because they make stuff more expensive for you and me. As it turns out, JQ's biggest mistake was signing the Tariff of 1828, or as I and other critics like to call it, the Tariff of Abominations. It hurt both industry and farming alike, and even led to the Nullification Crisis. Andrew Jackson. Of course, his signing of the Indian Removal Act and causing the Trail of Tears was horrible, but I think Jackson's ill-informed, hard money policies ultimately hurt even more people. He refused to establish a new Bank of the United States, instead allowing state banks to just freely loan paper money to pretty much anyone who asked for it. In response to this crisis, Jackson issued an executive order that required all payment for federal government land to be paid for in either gold or silver. Well, this caused inflation to soar. Eventually, this all at least partially led to the Panic of 1837 and one of the worst depressions in American history. Normally, the president doesn't have much control over the economy, but Jackson's actions certainly played a big role causing this economic crisis. Martin Van Buren. So what was the Trail of Tears? Well, it was a series of forced displacements of around 60,000 people from the Cherokee, Muskogee, Seminole, Chickasaw, and Choctaw nations. They were forced out of their homes in the southeast and marched out west for thousands of miles. Most ended up in future Oklahoma. The relocated suffered from disease and starvation on the way, traveling often through harsh conditions. Andrew Jackson may have signed the Indian Removal Act and started the Trail of Tears, but it was Van Buren who carried out the most infamous part of the Trail of Tears: the removal of the Cherokee from Georgia. At least 4,000 of them died, many of them babies or small children, as they traveled on foot through a particularly harsh winter, most with no shoes on and little clothing. William Henry Harrison. Yeah, Harrison's biggest mistake while president was drinking the DC water. That's apparently what got him sick and led to his death just a month into his presidency. John Tyler. Believe it or not, Tyler didn't make many mistakes as president. Then again, he didn't accomplish much as president either. I think his biggest mistake was refusing to reestablish a national bank. He even vetoed a bill to charter one. While central banks have not always made things completely all rosy throughout history, most economists argue that they have kept markets stable and helped prevent economic crashes. In fact, that aforementioned Panic of 1837 likely would have been avoided if there had been a central bank in place to regulate banking transactions and help failing banks. After Tyler vetoed the national bank, it wouldn't come back for a while, and for the rest of the century, the country experienced some of its worst bank runs and recessions ever. James Polk. Polk's biggest mistake was starting an unjust war with Mexico. Polk was basically an imperialist who knew that if he sent troops into disputed territory along the Texas-Mexico border, he would likely be starting a war. In fact, I'd argue he hoped it would happen. To Mexico, it was an invasion. It was completely reasonable for Mexico to attack American troops, as a matter of fact, which they did on April 25th, 1846. Polk couldn't have designed it any better. He went to Congress, urging them to declare war on Mexico, claiming that they, quote, shed American blood upon American soil. Congress, of course, went along with it, but it's long past due that we all admit that the Mexican-American War was a war of aggression, a war of imperialism meant simply to expand the nation's borders. Zachary Taylor. Taylor was only in office for 16 months, but that was enough to make mistakes. Taylor's biggest mistake was raising tensions in the months leading up to the Compromise of 1850. Despite being a slave owner himself, Taylor rejected any compromise with the slave states to let them expand slavery out west, as originally agreed to under the Missouri Compromise. I appreciated Taylor taking the very clear clear anti-slavery stance, but in doing so, his rhetoric only further disillusioned Southern leaders and sped up the path straight toward civil war, which I guess was inevitable by this point, but still, Taylor made it worse. Millard Fillmore. After Taylor died in office, Fillmore took over and supported the Compromise of 1850. Except that he was perfectly fine with the worst part of it. He signed the Fugitive Slave Act, which made it so that the federal government was responsible for finding and returning escaped slaves, even if they were in a free state. Yep, free states had to cooperate. This was definitely a law that led directly to the Civil War. Franklin Pierce. Speaking of laws that led directly to the Civil War, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Pierce signed that law, which is easily one of the worst federal laws ever passed in American history. It opened Kansas for settlement and allowed the new settlers to determine whether it would be admitted as a slave state or a free state. Naturally, this caused a mad rush of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates to Kansas, and violence would often occur between the two groups. That's how the territory earned the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Pierce literally caused the prequel to the Civil War. James Buchanan. Sure, Buchanan was a corrupt dude who did some shady stuff to help only him and his friends while in office, but his biggest mistake was allowing Southern states to secede. Not only did he refuse to send down federal troops to prevent them from doing so, he didn't even talk trash about Southern leaders when they began to do so. He was like, oh, well, I personally don't think seceding is a good idea, but you do you, South. So Buchanan didn't just do nothing to prevent the Civil War, he did something to cause it. Isn't that something? Abraham Lincoln. You may already be noticing a pattern here. If you mess with the First Amendment, I got problems with you. And yes, Abraham Lincoln messed with the First Amendment. He arrested journalists and newspaper publishers who criticized his handling of the Civil War. His administration censored mail and telegraphs that undermined the war. Lincoln had people arrested singing Confederate songs, for crying out loud. I don't care if it was wartime. That's messed up, man. Andrew Johnson. Yeah, I think Johnson made plenty of mistakes, but I think his biggest one was causing the Black Codes to happen. The Black Codes were laws passed by Southern states designed to make the lives of recently freed slaves miserable. Essentially, slavery was now illegal after the passing of the 13th Amendment, but the Black Codes made it so African Americans still felt enslaved. After the Civil War ended, Johnson allowed pro-slavery Southern legislatures to quickly take back over, and yeah, nearly all of them passed Black Codes. Ulysses Grant. Grant's biggest mistake was supporting and enforcing the Comstock laws. It all started with his signing of the Comstock Act of 1873, which made it illegal to mail stuff or receive stuff in the mail that was obscene, lewd, immoral, or indecent. It was another slap in the face of the First Amendment. After Grant signed the law, a dude named Anthony Comstock, who all these laws were named after, became the enforcer against bad stuff in the mail. He arrested an activist named Ezra Haywood after Haywood mailed one of his pamphlets, which made the claim that women should have the right to control their own bodies. Comstock also arrested another dude for receiving the pamphlet in the mail. Rutherford Hayes. Okay, Hayes, I get why you did this as part of the Compromise of 1877, but it still sucked that you did it. Hayes' biggest mistake was removing federal troops from the South, marking the end of Reconstruction and directly leading to a dramatic rise of white supremacist rule throughout the South. African Americans no longer had federal protection and for decades would be treated in the South as second-class citizens. James Garfield. Garfield's biggest mistake was letting the media know his schedule. That's how Charles Guiteau knew Garfield was going to be at the Baltimore Potomac Railroad Station on July 2nd, 1881. There, Guiteau shot Garfield. Now, Garfield's other biggest mistake was trusting his doctor, Willard Bliss. Garfield was actually starting to recover before Bliss screwed things up. While trying to get his bullet out with unsterilized fingers and tools, he caused a severe infection, which ultimately led to Garfield dying from septic shock. Chester Arthur. Arthur's biggest mistake was signing the Chinese Exclusion Act, another one of the worst laws in American history. It banned the immigration of Chinese who were coming over to do manual, unskilled labor, which the country desperately needed help with, by the way. It led to similar laws that further discriminated against Chinese Americans in the coming decades. Not only that, it led to what's known as the driving out era, a period in which anti-Chinese Americans assaulted and even killed Chinese Americans if they didn't get out of their communities. The bottom line is, Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act because of xenophobia, an irrational fear of Chinese people. Grover Cleveland. How about another crappy law? Cleveland's biggest mistake was signing the Dawes Act. The law said the president could subdivide Native American tribal communal land holdings into portions for individual heads of families to privately own, and opened up leftover plots to the general public to settle. This law single-handedly led to tribes across the country losing around 62% of their land, but its main goal was to force them to be more like Americans. Benjamin Harrison. Harrison's biggest mistake also hurt Native Americans. And I'm not talking about his proclamation opening up Indian territory to American settlement. I'm talking about the fact that, under his authority, the U.S. Army murdered around 146 Sioux on December 29, 1890, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota. Today we call this the Wounded Knee Massacre. And not only did Harrison approve of it, but he gave out medals of honor to 20 of the American soldiers guilty of the massacre. Jeez, dude. William McKinley. McKinley's biggest mistake was the Philippine-American War. A war so messed up that you wouldn't believe what happened in it. If I told you 20 times, it was an unjust war from the very start. The Filipinos had just gained independence from Spain, and McKinley now wanted the United States to control them. Of course, they resisted, and between 1899 and 1902, perhaps as many as 1 million Filipino civilians died because of it. American forces burned villages, threw Filipinos into concentration camps, and tortured Filipinos who were suspected of rebelling against Americans. There's other horrible stuff American troops did, but I won't go into detail in case there are any kids watching. This war is one of the ugliest parts of American history, and McKinley was responsible for it. Theodore Roosevelt. As much as I talk trash about Teddy's crappy foreign policy, I give him mad props for it improving throughout his presidency. He was a man who changed his mind when learning new information, after all. However, one thing still stands out as a pretty big mistake during his presidency: the Brownsville Affair. In Brownsville, Texas, in August 1906, after someone killed a white bartender and injured a white police officer, the town's residents all decided to blame all the members of the African-American 25th Infantry Regiment, even though there was no evidence they actually did it. Well, Roosevelt thought they were guilty, ordering 167 of the 25th Infantry Regiment's soldiers dishonorably discharged. In other words, Teddy didn't allow them to have due process of the law. They were guilty until proven innocent. By the way, the Army found them innocent in 1972. By then, only 2 of them were still alive. William Howard Taft. Taft's biggest mistake was signing the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act, a law that mostly raised tariffs and was so controversial that it deeply split the Republican Party. Taft himself was quite proud of the new law, later calling it, quote, the best tariff bill the Republican Party ever passed. While it did lower tariffs on some items, it raised it on others and ultimately just frustrated everyone. It also made the Philippines heavily dependent on the United States. Woodrow Wilson. Wilson's biggest mistake...
Wilson?
Yes. He had many mistakes, but I think his biggest mistake was signing the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Passed after the United States entered World War I, the Espionage Act made it illegal to interfere in the war effort in any way. The Sedition Act made it a crime to say, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive stuff about the American government, armed forces, or even its flag. According to historian Paul Averick, as many as 1,000 people went to prison as a result of the Espionage and Sedition Acts signed by Wilson. Some of them got sentences up to 20 years in prison. Again, in my view, these are laws that strongly went against the First Amendment. Warren Harding. The 1920s were not good in terms of xenophobia and anti-immigrant legislation in general, and Harding definitely played a role in that. His biggest mistake was signing the Emergency Quota Act, a law restricting immigration from certain countries that were, quote, undesirable. In reality, it was just meant to restrict immigrants coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. That said, I also have two dishonorable mentions for Harding. He signed the crappy Forney-McCumber tariff. Hey, you know how I feel about tariffs. And the Revenue Act of 1921, which was really just a law super wealthy people wanted passed since they didn't like paying taxes. Calvin Coolidge. Speaking of crappy immigration laws, Coolidge's biggest mistake was signing the Immigration Act of 1924, which expanded xenophobia to Asia. It heavily restricted immigration from Asia. It's even also called the Asian Exclusion Act, by the way. Together with the Emergency Quota Act, the Immigration Act of 1924 favored immigrants from Northern and Western Europe, for some reason. I guess it was because their skin color tended to be lighter. Anyway, the xenophobic immigration system solidified by this law stayed in place until the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965. Immigrants have historically made the United States very strong as a country. In fact, we'd probably be screwed without them, and Coolidge's immigration law essentially shut the door on most immigrants. Herbert Hoover. The Great Depression. No, we can't blame the entire Depression on Hoover, but he did make it worse. Hoover's biggest mistake was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which was supposed to encourage people to buy American-made stuff by placing tariffs and thus increasing the cost of imported stuff. Instead, it led to trading partners retaliating by raising their tariff rates and ultimately froze international trade, causing companies' sales to drop everywhere. In fact, this one law dramatically made the Great Depression worse. Soon after Hoover signed it, the banks began to fail. By the end of 1931, nearly 2,300 banks had failed, and $1.7 billion in deposits were lost. Franklin Roosevelt. FDR's biggest mistake was forcing more than 125,000 Japanese Americans to live in concentration camps, completely stripping them of their freedoms, despite no evidence that any of them were conspiring to help Japan in World War II. If you want to learn more about it, I have a video here you can check out, and another video about it here. Then again, by this point, you're probably depressed and have lost all faith in humanity, so maybe you don't want to learn more about this stuff. Harry Truman. Truman's biggest mistake was the Cold War. Wait, the entire Cold War? Well, kind of, yeah. He escalated tensions that contributed to the Cold War happening in the first place. For starters, his foreign policy, famously known as the Truman Doctrine, called for military interventions all over the world in the name of, quote, support for democracies against authoritarian threats. Say, did that mean at home, too? Anyway, whether it was getting the United States involved in the Korean War, giving military and economic aid to countries to fight governments friendly to the Soviet Union, quickly expanding the development of nuclear weapons, or destroying any chance of diplomacy with Soviet leaders, Truman's actions all played a big role in increasing tensions between the two countries. Don't get me wrong, I'd blame the Soviet Union's government just as much for causing the Cold War. They were far from innocent, but Truman's actions definitely played a key role as well. I always cut Truman some slack though. He was president during a tremendously difficult time in history. Dwight Eisenhower. Look, as you may already know, but his presidency was also not without mistakes. Particularly his reckless roundup of undocumented Mexican immigrants along the southern border and him signing Executive Order 10450, which contributed to the Lavender Scare. However, I think Ike's biggest mistake was allowing the CIA to help overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in favor of the Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, aka Operation Ajax. It was the first time the CIA directly orchestrated a coup of a democratically elected government, and it later led to a more radical government getting in there after the Iranian Revolution, which itself then led to the Iran hostage crisis. The bottom line is, Iranians would never forget the American government's involvement in overthrowing their popular leader. Even today, the governments of Iran and the United States have a poor relationship. And it all goes back to 1953 and Operation Ajax. John F. Kennedy. JFK's biggest mistake was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a failed military operation in which Cuban exiles landed in Cuba in order to attempt to overthrow Cuba's communist government led by Fidel Castro. Most historians acknowledge the invasion as one of the biggest foreign policy failures in American history. It made Castro even more of a hero and increased Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union. Not only that, it made Cuba a closer ally of the Soviet Union, setting the stage for the Cuban Missile Crisis the very next year. Lyndon Johnson. LBJ's biggest mistake was the escalation of troops in the Vietnam War. Not only do most historians view the war as a costly disaster, LBJ's justification for dramatically increasing troop levels there to fight it was partially based on a straight-up lie. Congress agreed to escalate troops there after the two attacks that together became known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. As it turns out, American soldiers provoked the first attack, and the second attack, well, that never happened. LBJ and his administration completely lied about it. So ultimately, tens of thousands of American troops ended up dying based on this lie. Richard Nixon. You might be thinking that Watergate was Nixon's biggest mistake, or perhaps his secret bombing of Cambodia and Laos, as revealed in the Pentagon Papers. But I'd argue him starting the war on drugs was his biggest mistake. It was more than just words.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
Nixon created the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement, which eventually morphed into the Drug Enforcement Administration, or DEA, who mostly went after non-violent drug offenders. Incarceration rates have skyrocketed ever since, with people of color disproportionately being arrested and convicted with harsher sentences than other groups, even though everybody uses drugs at the same rate. In fact, many argue Nixon's Reagan's war on drugs was mostly racially motivated. Nixon signed the Controlled Substances Act, which criminalized drug abuse and said, without any evidence whatsoever, that marijuana and psilocybin were just as dangerous as heroin and more dangerous than cocaine. Ever since, people who have needed medical treatment have instead been sent to prison with violent offenders. According to some estimates, the United States has spent more than $1 trillion fighting the war on drugs. And the drugs won the war. By the way, drug use today is arguably as common as ever. Gerald Ford. Ford wasn't president long enough to do much damage, but I'd argue his biggest mistake was his support of the brutal Indonesian dictator Suharto and his invasion of East Timor from 1975 to 1976. It led to tens of thousands of civilians dying, and Ford gave Suharto the weapons that led to those deaths. Jimmy Carter. This one is easy, and Carter himself even later admitted that this was a big mistake on his part. How he handled the Iran hostage crisis, which I have a video about, of course. I'm always making videos and stuff. No matter what Carter seemed to do, whether it be economic pressure, diplomacy, or even sending in the military to try to rescue them, things just didn't go right to rescue those 63 American hostages. Ronald Reagan. Simply put, Reagan's biggest mistake might be something named after him: Reaganomics. Reaganomics is basically the economic policies popularized and associated with Reagan, but they're nothing new. You know, stuff like deregulation, tightening the money supply to fight inflation, and reducing the federal income tax and capital gains taxes. And to be honest, I'm personally a fan of all that stuff, at least to a certain extent. However, Reaganomics took all that to the extreme, and many economists say that his policies dramatically reduced economic mobility, meaning ever since it's been much more difficult for Americans to get out of poverty. Economists also argue Reaganomics has led to a widening income gap. The rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer, basically. It also has definitely led to a general trend of the national debt spiraling out of control. George H.W. Bush. Although a dishonorable mention ought to go to Operation Just Cause, which was when the United States invaded Panama to overthrow their leader Manuel Noriega. I think Bush Sr.'s biggest mistake was pardoning 6 of the convicted criminals associated with the Iran-Contra Affair. Simply put, I think it greatly undermined the idea that no person is above the law. And yes, I have a video about that too, sorry. All this homework for you. Bill Clinton. Clinton usually gets remembered for his personal scandals, especially the Monica Lewinsky scandal that ultimately led to him being impeached, but I think some of the laws he signed were much more damaging for the country. 3 laws stand out to me in particular as doing way more harm than good. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, aka the 1994 Crime Bill, the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, and the Telecommunications Act of 1996. While the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act had good aspects, like decreasing unemployment, saving the federal government money, and decentralizing welfare management, it completely ignored existing systemic problems and has arguably led to even more poverty among people of color and more non-violent drug offenders having a more difficult time after they get out of prison. The Telecommunications Act of 1996 caused a small number of giant corporations to control nearly all media, making it much more difficult these days for independent musicians, filmmakers, and artists to have their stuff discovered. But Clinton's biggest mistake was signing the 1994 Crime Bill, which gave money to states to build new prisons and hire new police officers, but also led to much stricter prison sentences overall. Because of that law, tens of thousands of people got far more harsh punishments than they deserved. And just like the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Identity Act, the 1994 crime bill, made systemic racism much worse. People of color got arrested more than whites and got harsher sentences than whites for the exact same crimes. By the way, Clinton himself has admitted that signing this law was his biggest mistake. George W. Bush. This is another easy one. Bush Jr.'s biggest mistake was Operation Iraqi Freedom. Bush's invasion of Iraq in 2003 was mostly a huge failure based on lies. The Iraq War and war in Iraq later on both devastated the country, leading to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of innocent people and the loss of tens of billions of dollars due to damage, and Bush and his administration were mostly to blame for it. Barack Obama. Obama's biggest mistake was the expansion and normalization of the use of armed drones. He dramatically increased drone warfare, targeting suspected terrorists in multiple countries, often ignoring the sovereignty of those countries, and he dropped many of these bombs on innocent civilians. In fact, as much as more than 15% of the casualties were civilians. He normalized the use of drone warfare, which I think, frankly,
is pretty messed up.
Related to this, Obama killed this 16-year-old American citizen with a drone strike. Now, it may have been an accident, but geez, man. The kid didn't do anything wrong. That was murder. Donald Trump. Oh, Trump loved drone warfare too. He possibly killed even more civilians than Obama did, but we won't know for a really long time if that's true or not, since he kept all that information secret. It's classified, baby. But what's not secret is his blatant attempts to overturn the legitimate presidential election of 2020. After he lost the election, he repeatedly lied about there being widespread voter fraud, and in the process riled up his devoted followers, creating political chaos across the country that culminated with the January 6th United States Capitol attack. By undermining the 2020 election, he put our entire electoral system in jeopardy. Even today, tens of millions of Americans still believe there was widespread voter fraud, and it's only mostly because Trump insisted there was. It's certainly not because of their so-called evidence. I've looked very closely at this so-called evidence, and it's crap. I'm sorry, there's nothing there of substance. Joe Biden. While the withdrawal from Afghanistan was a disaster, that would have probably been a disaster no matter who was in charge. Therefore, I'm going with his forcing private companies with 100 or more employees to enforce a vaccine mandate. It eventually got struck down by the Supreme Court, as it should have been in my opinion. But hey, Biden's still in office. I'm sure if he tries hard enough, he can make an even bigger mistake. And there you have it, every president's biggest mistake. And I should stress, these are my opinions. Sometimes I make mistakes. In fact, if you think I made a mistake about these mistakes, do not be mistaken. Please comment below your mistakes. Hopefully it was not a mistake to make this video. Inflation sucks, but Mrs. Beat and I have found one way, at least, to save money lately by using Upside. You may not know this about me, but I like to get gas. It's true, I'm always filling up my automobile with this stuff, and Upside helps me save money. I just scan my receipt, and Upside gives me cash back on every purchase for doing something I do anyway. You also may not know this about me, but I also like to eat. We've also been using Upside for cash back when we dine out or buy groceries. Not only that, we've used the cashback rewards to get gift cards to places like Starbucks and Texas Roadhouse. In comparison to credit card rewards or loyalty programs, you can earn 3 times more cash back with Upside, and Upside doesn't sell your personal information to third parties. Upside users are earning hundreds of dollars a year, which is probably why they have a 4.8 star rating on the App Store. Try Upside yourself. Download the app for free and use code MrBeat to get an extra 25 cents back for every gallon on your first tank of gas. I'm Mr. Beat. You got a problem with that? Come on, let's go. Step up if you got a problem with that. If you enjoyed this video, you're weird. But that's a compliment. And you should also check out another video I released a few months ago about every president's greatest achievement. I'm way more positive in that one, I promise. Now it's time for my monthly shout out to all my Patreon supporters who donate at least $15 or more each month to my channel, starting with my biggest donors alphabetically. Thank you to Bill Dowd, Pat Iapicca, Adam Lucky, Alicia Solberg, Andrew B., Anthony Beckett, Austin Ciros, Corey Ryman, Douglas Martin, Dr. Paul J. Lilly, Empty Machine, Isabel, Isaiah Warfield, Joe Cook, Matt Standish, Nick Everett, Osbers Gaming, Owen, Sammy, Samuel Striz, Sean Connett, Society's Basement, Adam Christians, Andrew Snyder, Grant Hughes, Ian Driscoll, Ika Sanjika 615, Elon Capone, Jack L., Jacob Birnbaum, Joel Serrano Lozada, KZ210QB, Oliver E., LT Marshall, Naderade, Stacy, Steve Bryan, Thomas Oppenheim, Warren Girard, Waterfort, and Zachary F. Parker. Thank you to all my Patreon supporters, and thank you for watching.